Hi, I'm Anthony Underwood, and this is Greetings from Appalachia. On this week's show, I'll be interviewing Peshka Calloway, a U.S. Army veteran, organizer, and activist in West Virginia. She's a humanitarian who centers her work on access to reproductive health care and identification. We will be speaking to her about voting rights and reproductive rights. But first, J.D. Vance is the latest in a line of grifters and exploiters of Appalachian culture, history, and its people to try to make a name for himself, to enrich himself at our expense. In 2016, Vance published a memoir about his relatives from Kentucky's Appalachian region and ancestors while growing up in the non-Appalachian part of Ohio. In it, he used his limited personal experience to make broad, sweeping pronouncements about the entirety of Appalachia. Specifically, he focused on generational poverty, drug addiction, and the like. It is essentially the writings of an angry, overgrown boy blaming the victims for their own oppression. That book made him famous, as it came out at a time when the news and other academic researchers were trying to figure out why this region constantly and consistently votes against its best interests in support primarily of Republicans, and as a nearly solid bloc had voted for Trump in the 2016 election. It was and is a terrible, misleading, mean-spirited, and simplistic book that was turned into an even worse movie in 2020.
Do you actually want to be dead, Mom? Or are you just too lazy to try?
Oh, I tried!
In his book, Vance, while relating the struggles of other members of his family with things such as employment, income, and addiction, and other social challenges, continually pats himself on the back for avoiding these pitfalls, repeatedly attacks members of the Appalachian region for not having his same personal resources, fortitude, and opportunities. He does little more than attacking the victim for their perceived weaknesses, blaming them essentially for being born into a region chronically mistreated and exploited by our nation and for its coal, natural gas, lumber, and retail resources. At one point, Vance essentially says if you want to fix Appalachia, then the folks in Appalachia simply need to be more religious and stop whining.
This church in the heart of Appalachia is completely quiet just before the service begins, except for the creature inside this locked box. It's a rattlesnake, and it's rattling. It's one of 7 deadly snakes, about to be used in a wild ceremony in God's name.
An easy thing to do or say from your home outside of the region when you're not mired in generations of neglect, poor educational environment, lack of acceptable medical care, public water systems, public sewage systems, and far more. Instead of asking why much of Appalachia has historically suffered from economic exploitation, strike breaking, union busting, and a gross lack of public funding for the most common of government services, easily accessible in every other part of the country, he blames Appalachian citizens for their own exploitation. And now, Vance wants to be your Republican senator from the state of Ohio. It was once enough to merely blame poor people and people of color for their own suppression and exploitation if you wanted to be a Republican senator. But now you have to kiss the ring. The ring on the tiny, greasy, orange Cheeto finger of Donald Trump. And that's a problem for our friend J.D. Vance. He has 4 competitors for the Republican nomination, and he clearly hasn't kissed Trump's ample ass enough. You see, in 2016, when most folks thought Trump was going to lose, and lose badly, Vance came out in interviews and in his Twitter feed against Trump, whom he called reprehensible, where he questioned his morality and said that he would consider voting for either Hillary Clinton or the third-party candidate, Evan McMullin. Vance went so far as to call Trump a fraud, saying that he was exploiting, quote, those people, end quote, when talking about the people of Kentucky with radio host Matt Jones in August 2016. So negative were Vance's public statements about Trump that Vance deleted every negative tweet he could find that he had made about Trump when he announced his candidacy for the Senate in March of 2021. In fact, one of the first things he did when announcing his candidacy was to apologize to Trump, saying that now he has changed his tune and supports Trump because he likes Trump's policies. His policies? Policies like caging kids at the border for years, separating kids from their parents, and losing the information required to reunite them, allowing more than 600,000 deaths due to COVID because of misinformation and incompetency, allowing Russia and its allies to constantly spy on America and put bounties on the heads of U.S. soldiers without consequence. The tax breaks he gave to the wealthy, creating gigantic federal deficits, encouraging a surrection against the federal government, and outright support for white supremacy and fascism, somehow thinks that it's better, that supporting these policies of Trump is somehow better than liking Trump the man. It might actually be worse. Henry of Navarre, who became Henry IV of France, started his reign in 1589. It was a terrible time for France, as the French Catholic majority was deeply involved in a religious civil war with the sizable minority of French Protestants. Henry essentially ended these wars because he himself was a Protestant and next in line for the throne. He was told he could only become King of France if he converted to Catholicism, and so he did, and went on to create more tolerance for Protestants and all but end that particular religious civil war. Henry was assassinated for his efforts. But before that, when asked why he would give up his Protestantism to become the Catholic King of France, he said, "Paris is well worth a mass." Seems that J.D. Vance, veteran snake oil salesman that he is, has decided that the Senate is worth a brown, or rather orange, nose. Now let's welcome Peshka Calloway, U.S. Army veteran, activist, and native Appalachian. Welcome, Ms. Calloway. It's so good to see you again. Thanks for being here.
Oh, thank you. I'm so excited.
Good. So you've been very busy as an activist for voter registration in Central Appalachia for several years. What are the challenges that most people don't think about when it comes to voter registration?
Oh, so much. Everyone thinks that, a voter registration event should happen like at a, high school football stadium or like at a farmer's market. But a lot of times we forget about those that are living in shelters, whether it's a homeless shelter, recovery center, even going down to DHHR and making sure people are registered there,
Or
of course,
by
colleges,
you,
etc.
you mean you're in West Virginia, so you're talking about the Health and Human Resources, so those types of organizations.
Yes, yes. So public service organizations. I've been asked by some folks that align with me ideologically, like why I wasn't going down to a farmer's market to register folks to vote. And it's just like usually the people at farmers markets are already registered to vote.
Right.
I want to target and work with people who have never had a conversation
Right.
about voting.
Why aren't you going to Whole Foods in the country club?
It gets me every single time when people are like, why, Peshka, why aren't you going to this fair festival? And it's like, depending on what that fair and festival entails, like a lot of the people there are already registered to vote. They're already getting exposure to a lot of campaign commercials, a lot of, have access to the internet. So they're exposed to get out the vote messaging on like YouTube, Facebook, all that. And there's some people in our communities that don't have access to the internet who aren't being encouraged and empowered to lend their voice. Another issue with voting is that every time that there's a proposed ID law, so when a state says we're imposing an ID law or we have voter ID laws, people assume that it is just like you have to have some form of like driver's license or a physical ID, like a state ID or like the new federal real ID. And that's not necessarily the case. Like in places like West Virginia, we have voter ID, but the voter ID requirements are so broad that you could even, like if the poll worker knows you, can vouch for you and allow you to vote. But just the sheer fact of having that barrier, mentioning or bringing up voter ID in and of itself, like governments proposing ID laws, is voter suppression in the sense that people assume who aren't already plugged in, like, or are civically engaged, like assume that they have to have some sort of like photo ID to vote. And so that's one of the biggest barriers. Like I had a woman who was disabled who didn't drive anymore. And she thought that she needed a physical ID to vote and hadn't been engaged in the electoral process for like 5 to 10 years. And so empowering her and letting her know, like, I don't know where you heard that from. That's misinformation. You can go to the polls as long as you have a ride, or have a way of transportation. You can go with just your birth certificate. You could take your social security card. You could take your Medicare card, all of that.
Right. So since November 2020, the election in November 2020, a number of states, obviously mostly states, if only states dominated by the Republican Party in the legislature and their executive role, have started to lay a lot of voter suppression laws on the books. We presume in a kind of an unhidden effort to reduce a lot of the gains that minority voters and women voters and progressive voters made through their participation in the 2020 elections. Some of these are so harsh that some people are referring to them as a new Jim Crow era. How do you think these types of laws are going to affect rural and population center voters in Appalachia?
I'm getting like a flood of like so much stuff right now because I'm currently working on this in regards to the For the People Act And, we already have, I believe it's 14 or 17 states that have enacted voter restrictions in the country. We're looking at more that are being proposed. Once the legislatures across the country and in different states meet, then they're preparing to pass voter restrictive legislation. And that looks like for rural communities, people that are, that work full-time jobs, we don't have like election day off.
Right.
So people take advantage of early voting days. And so we're seeing those being like cut down, shorter times for early voting. In Georgia, it's to the point where like other outside interests or people that want to ensure that the voters standing in long lines are taken care of with water and snacks can't even provide that. To make sure that people are hydrated while they stand in line. And so each state is enacting different voter registration laws. Sometimes it even includes like signature laws. We've seen that. I know Georgia has that like signature verification. They've already been doing that. But then like we're expecting to see like some sort of photo ID requirement, which is very much like a poll tax, pretty much like a Jim Crow era count the marbles in the mason jar to be able to have access to vote. And so as a veteran, I'm a veteran, I'm working with other veterans right now to tell their stories of what it looked like for them to fight for this country, to now see this regressive legislation coming through. We believe, like in the Army, you'd never leave a soldier behind. We have veterans who are shouting from the rooftops, we don't leave any voter behind either.
Right. And that's so important. It's really just been appalling, and I like your equation of that to the old poll tax system that was developed primarily in the South, but other places as well in post-Civil War counter Reconstruction, the white Southerner revolt about around a lot of the civil rights laws that were passed shortly after the Civil War. So
absolutely. And another thing is like IDs are more expensive than the poll taxes that were proposed in the Jim Crow South. Like IDs are ridiculously expensive. An average ID costs $40. A birth certificate, depending on where you're born, can range from $13 if you need a replacement to get an ID up to $80. And that includes shipping.
I'll do it.
And a lot of people don't know how to navigate the system.
Right. Absolutely. So what do you think, given all of that, and given the recent decision by the Supreme Court to not challenge or force states to change these new laws, what do you think is the likelihood that Congress, because it seems like the Supreme Court has said, hey, we're not doing anything here. If you want to change this, then you have to change federal law. So what do you think the likelihood is that Congress will act on this before 2022 elections?
I'm holding on hope that we can get the John Lewis Act through, and that we can get for the People Act passed and through. But of course, we have people who are openly resisting allowing people to have their voices heard at the polls. We have really, I can never, every day I wake up and I just cannot comprehend or even empathize or even just understand where the other side is coming from in regards to giving people less rights to our democracy. Like, as a veteran, again, and working with veterans right now, that's what's appalling us the most, is that we have a party out there that's actively ensuring that people don't have access to our democracy, that can't go to the polls and cast their ballot for who they think is a great leader,
right.
for their like city council, for the mayor, whatever it may be. They can't lend their voices. And this, since 2013, we've seen these attempts to roll back access to the ballot. And I never thought we would be here today. But we're, the last election and then January 6th, And then everything that's occurring after J6, after the 2020 election, it's an open attack on our democratic values, on America's integrity. And so what I'm calling for, what other vets like me are calling for, is that our senators, our congresspeople, congressmen and women really need to have that integrity and like not be influenced by like dark money, big money interests. And that's the only barrier that we're seeing right now is big money interests who are like, no, because we don't want the people to have their voice, have a bigger voice over our dollars.
Right. So, you look at someone, you and I both live in West Virginia, and you look at someone like Senator Joe Manchin, who has the most charitable thing to say, I think, is that he's put brakes on moving forward with many of these federal voting reforms and federal guarantees. He's the last Democratic major office holder in the state of West Virginia, and maybe the last for a while unless things change. Which is a big change for a generational change for West Virginia, because over the past century, Appalachia went from being this bastion and fortress of people fighting for labor rights and union accessibility to being a place that almost consistently votes for corporate and conservative interests against their own. So how can progressives counteract that shift in voter values, do you think?
Conversation. We need to have more conversations with those in our community. I think social media, honestly, is the most toxic place to have a conversation. Like when you go into, like, I go on my local, like the local news, like comment section, and I'm like, wow, like people are so stringent and held to their beliefs. But once you have, it doesn't even have to be a face-to-face conversation, like a phone conversation. I know social media has been great about rolling out audio platforms to have conversations, like Facebook's rolling theirs out, Twitter has theirs, we have Clubhouse, Spotify also is creating like clubhouses that you can get on and have an actual conversation. And I think that is going to be progressives' tool, like the most baddest tool that we could use in our arsenal from here on out, because we can then verbally dispel misinformation, but we can also story tell and find things that we can have common ground on. I was just on a radio show on Friday and had someone who was extremely, it was pretty conservative. And we had a heart-to-heart conversation where, I was able to dispel myths. He surprisingly dispelled some myths with me. And then at the end of it, like, it was very, very emotional where I talked about a situation with my son. I think, in West Virginia, with our history of labor rights and in our union activity, you got the mine wars, all of that, even the term redneck. I think the reason why our labor movements were so successful, our fights in West Virginia were so successful, is because we actually talked to one another. We organized with one another, and it didn't matter what side of the political spectrum they were on, whether they were Democrat, Republican, not voters or whatever. We were able to have conversations. And I think social media has been at the root of separating us and segregating us. And I think, surprisingly, social media, especially with audio platforms, may be something that can bring us together.
Interesting. Yeah, I think it's an analogous situation where news, whether it's your local news or even national news, all too often are short, facile, conflict-driven, or not even, or in the case of local media, not even conflict-driven, just acquiescence-driven. But then you look at the world of podcasts, and that's where you get these deep, multi-episode dives into complex issues. I mean, there's a lot of junk there too, but you also have a lot of incredible investigative content, social science on there, history, real history. It's fantastic if you know where to look. And so I agree. I think that there's a chance for deeper connection done correctly. And I think maybe there's something to the idea of hearing someone's voice and not just reading their words that will make you hold back from your stringency a little bit and listen, so. And if progressives have the better argument, and I think 9 out of 10 times we do, if people are listening, then we win some people that way. So that
absolutely.
Yeah. So just one last topic, and I wanted to also acknowledge, you've had a great history in working for places like Planned Parenthood and working and championing reproductive rights. What's the connection between reproductive rights and voting rights?
Oh, so I think I work from a space of, being a Black woman, focused on like reproductive justice, which does tie in like environmental justice, which does tie in economic justice, and so many things that impact our bodies, right? And we know like when a corporation can, I'm not going to name the corporation, but corporation who spills C8 in our water impacts our ability to have children, to choose not to have children, or to raise our children in healthy and clean environments, which is the main tenet of reproductive justice. When you have a corporation that disregards health and safety, or corporations that disregard health and safety of the communities that exist in and impacts our health, that is something that we have to go to the polls about. We have to, ask and demand, and not ask, demand better regulations of corporations. You also see like so many times, and it just hit me so many times, restrictions on our access to reproductive health care.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why it's so vital and so important to go out to vote, to lend your voice at the polls. It doesn't matter what side of the aisle, you're on, but, putting your voice out there, casting your ballot is so crucial. I, though, when I vote, don't necessarily like bring my personal like feelings about things there. Like when I cast my ballot, it's more of like, I'm casting my ballot for everyone else. Like, it's not just a me thing. Like, I want fairness and access for everyone.
Right.
I don't care what my personal religion is. I don't care, whether I have religion, don't have religion. It doesn't matter to me. What matters to me is that my voice is for my community, and it's for my greater state, and it's for the nation, to improve.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
To improve and give more rights. Like, we could always have more rights and more access. I don't know where we've gone where it's like, no, let's take away some rights and access. Like, that blows my mind.
And I think some of the telling points of what you're saying there is that it's telling that the American public, between 70 and 80%, support a woman's right to choose regarding her pregnancy, the status of her pregnancy. It's getting close to a consensus that the vast majority of the American public are supportive of those rights. Of course, they should be rights whether they are or not, but they are. But then you have a Supreme Court that is threatening in a significant way how those rights will be managed or be granted or what have you, or accessed. You have a party where the Republican Party, where 60% of the Republicans in the country are supportive of it, and yet the vast majority of Republican office holders are not. And so you have to ask yourself, what's really going on there? Is it a lack of access from voters who don't get to express their opinion and shape their representatives in that way? So, well, Peshka, I wanted to thank you so much for being here this evening and talking with us. And I know we'll talk more in the future, but thank you very much. And thank you for the work that you do for everyone in Appalachia.
Oh, no problem. Thank you for having me. It's been an honor.
Have a good night.